Margaret learned her husband's grief the way she learned everything in that house, by watching what nobody explained. The wedding had been small and cold and over before she understood what it meant. One week, she was a woman with a modest name and a smaller dowry, and the next, she was the Duchess of Ashworth, married to a man who spoke perhaps 40 words a day, and none of them to her. His name was Julian. She had to remind herself of that sometimes, because in her own mind she had started calling him simply the Duke, the way the servants did, the way the whole house seemed to hold its breath around him. Dinner was the worst of it. Not because the food was poor, it was extraordinary. Roast pheasant and buttered parsnips and a claret that probably cost more than her father's yearly income, but because they ate it in silence, so complete she could hear the scrape of china on linen, the small, private sound of her own swallowing. She had imagined in the weeks before the wedding that marriage might be lonely in the ordinary way. She had not imagined it would be lonely like this. Across a table lit with too many candles, a man's face carved out of shadow and unwillingness to speak. She had tried it first. Small talk, the kind her mother had drilled into her for exactly this purpose. Comments on the weather, questions about his day. He answered in fragments, courteous but final, like a door closing gently so as not to wake someone. After the second week she stopped trying, not out of anger, but because she had realized something that surprised her. His silence did not feel like cruelty. It felt like something else. Something older than her, older than their marriage. Something that lived in him the way a splinter lives under skin. Forgotten until it's touched. So, she watched instead. It was the only skill she had ever been permitted to keep for herself growing up, the art of noticing what people didn't say, because in her father's house, what wasn't said was usually the only truth available. She noticed now that Julian never sat at the head of the table when the fire was lit on the left side of the room. She noticed he flinched almost imperceptibly at the sound of a wine glass set down too hard. She noticed that he ate everything on his plate except the pheasant every single night, moving it to the edge with his fork like a man clearing debris. It took her 3 weeks to understand why. She found the answer not through him, but through Mrs. Pierce, the housekeeper, a woman with steel-gray hair and the kind of loyalty that had outlasted 2 generations of Ashworths. Margaret had asked carefully, delicately, whether His Grace disliked game birds. Mrs. Pierce had gone very still, the way people go still when a question brushes too near a wound. "His brother," she said finally. "Master Edmund." He choked at this very table. "Your Grace, 6 years past." On a bone from a pheasant, of all things. His Grace was sitting right across from him, couldn't save him in time. Margaret had said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound small against a fact like that. "He's had pheasants served every night since," Mrs. Pierce added, quieter now, as if confessing something shameful. "Won't let cook take it off the menu. Won't eat it either. I've never understood it myself. Some kind of penance, I think. Man doesn't forgive himself easy." That night, Margaret sat across from her husband and looked at him. Really looked, not the sideways cautious glances she'd allowed herself before, but a full, open study of his face, and she saw it for the first time. Not coldness. Grief, worn so long it had fossilized into something that looked like indifference from the outside, but was, up close, just a man holding very still. So the pain wouldn't move. She did not say anything about it. She understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that saying something would be its own kind of cruelty. Grief handled carelessly doesn't heal. It just moves house. Instead, the next evening, she asked cook, quietly, without fanfare, to serve something else. Not instead of the pheasant. Alongside it, a small dish, unassuming, tucked near his elbow. Nothing was said about why. He noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything. She was coming to understand it was one of the strange gifts of his silence, that he saw more of the world for having stopped narrating it aloud. His eyes moved to the new dish, then to her, and something crossed his face that she couldn't yet name. "You didn't have to do that," he said. 4 words. It was the longest sentence he'd offered her since the wedding night, when he'd told her, with a kind of grave courtesy, that he would not touch her, unless she wished it, and that she should tell him if she was cold or afraid or hungry, and he would see to it. She had thought, At the time, it was the coldest kindness she had ever received. She understood now. It had been the opposite. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He didn't answer. But he ate from the new dish, and that night, for the first time, the silence between them didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a room they were sitting in together, waiting for one of them to light a lamp. It became a pattern, after that, small and wordless, the way most true things in that house seemed to arrive. She never asked him about Edmund, she never mentioned the pheasant or Mrs. Pierce, or the fact that she now understood the shape of his silence, the way one learns the shape of a familiar room in the dark. She simply adjusted the world around him in small increments. A second candle moved from the left side of the table, where the fire's shadow had always seemed to unsettle him, a change in seating, so he no longer had a clear line of sight to the chair Edmund once occupied. She did it all so quietly that she wasn't certain for weeks whether he noticed at all. Then one evening he asked her to sit beside him instead of across. "The light's better here," he said, which she understood by then to be a translation. What he meant was something else entirely. What he meant was, "I would like to not have to look at that chair, and I would like to not have to explain why, and I trust you to let me not explain." She sat beside him. The candle flickered between them, close enough now that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, older than his years, put there by something that had happened at this very table. Dinner unfolded the way it always had. Quiet, but a different kind of quiet now. Warmer, the kind of quiet shared by two people, rather than endured by one in the presence of another. Halfway through the meal, without any preamble, he spoke. "He was 2 years younger," Julian said, looking at his plate rather than at her. "Edmund, he used to say grace faster than the vicar could manage, just to make our mother laugh. He was going to be the interesting one. I was always meant to be the dull heir, the one who managed the ledgers and married well and didn't embarrass anyone." Margaret said nothing. She had learned, in her short weeks in that house, that silence could be an invitation as much as a wall, and she offered him hers now, wide and unhurried, a place for him to keep talking if he wished, or to stop if he didn't. He kept talking. "I was across the table," he said. "I saw it happen, and I didn't move fast enough. Everyone says there was nothing to be done, that it happens sometimes, that a man can choke and die between one breath and the next, no matter who is standing near him. I know that. I know it the way one knows an answer to a sum without ever quite believing the number." He turned his wineglass a slow half-circle on the tablecloth. An old habit. She'd come to notice something his hands did when his voice had run out of places to go. "My mother could not look at me for a year afterward. Not because she blamed me, because I looked too much like him," she said. "We had the same eyes." She has since remarried and moved to Bath, and I do not fault her for either decision. "I'm not going anywhere," Margaret said before she quite decided to say it. He looked at her then, fully, the way he hadn't looked at her since the church, and something in his face loosened, like a stitch finally coming undone after being pulled too tight for too long. "No," he said slowly, as though testing the shape of the idea in his mouth. "I don't believe you are. It would be a lie to say that everything changed after that dinner, the way it might in a story told for its own neatness. Grief does not dissolve, because it has finally been spoken aloud, not entirely, not all at once. But something shifted in the architecture of the house after that night. Some load-bearing wall of silence quietly removed and replaced with something sturdier, an understanding, perhaps, that words were not required to prove a thing, but that they could, when offered without demand, deepen what silence alone had only sketched. Julian began speaking to her at breakfast, too. Brief exchanges at first, observations about the weather that were no longer merely courteous, but genuinely his, a comment on the particular gray of the sky before rain, a dry remark about the cook's growing ambition with sauces that made Margaret laugh before she could stop herself. "You laughed," he said the first time it happened, sounding almost startled by the fact of it. "You were funny," she said. "It happens, apparently, when a man decides to speak more than 4 words at a sitting." "I am reliably informed I do not make jokes," he said, entirely deadpan, and it took her a full second to realize that this too had been one. She found herself in the weeks that followed looking forward to dinner, in a way she had not thought possible in the first month of her marriage. Not because the house had become warm in any obvious sense. Ashworth Hall remained a vast, cold, echoing place, all marble floors and portraits of unsmiling ancestors, but because within it, at that one table, in that pool of candlelight, something private and unhurried had begun to grow. She learned things about him in fragments, the way sunlight comes through a shuttered window, in thin, bright lines, rather than a single flood. She learned he had wanted as a young man to travel. Italy, specifically, the light there, he said once, was supposed to be unlike anywhere else in the world, before his father's death had made him duke at 22, and closed that door, along with several others. She learned he read poetry in secret, hidden behind ledgers and estate correspondence, as though it were a vice rather than a comfort. She learned that his silence before her had not always been total, that it had crept over him slowly, years after Edmund's death, the way frost creeps over a window, and that by the time she arrived, most of the house had simply come to accept it as weather, as an unshakable feature of him rather than a wound still in the process of healing. And she began, slowly, to tell him things too. About her own childhood, the modest house she'd grown up in, her father's gentle uselessness with money, and her mother's quiet, competent management of a household that had never quite had enough. About the sketches she made in the margins of letters, small flowers and birds, a habit she'd never told anyone about because no one had ever asked. She showed him one, eventually, a study of a wren she'd drawn from memory after seeing it in the garden that morning, and he studied it for a long moment with an attention that made her feel oddly seen in a way she never had been before, not even by her own family. "You should draw the garden," he said. "All of it. There's an orangery no one uses anymore. It gets extraordinary light in the afternoon." "Is that an invitation, Your Grace?" "It's an observation," he said. "Do with it what you like." She drew in the orangery the next afternoon, and he came to find her there, not to watch, not at first, simply to sit with a book he did not read, in the far corner, as though his presence there needed no explanation, and she required none from him either. It became, without either of them naming it as such, a ritual. Afternoons in shared silence, evenings in tentative conversation, the whole rhythm of the house rearranging itself gently, gently, around the two of them. It was in one such afternoon, several weeks into this new and fragile peace, that Margaret found the letter. She had not been looking for anything. She had simply been searching the orangery's old writing desk for a fresh sheet of paper, her sketchbook full, and had opened a drawer that stuck slightly, requiring a firm tug, and inside it had found a bundle of correspondence tied with faded ribbon, clearly old, clearly untouched in years, given the fine layer of dust along the drawer's edge. She should have left it. She understood that even as her fingers were already working the ribbon loose, but something about the handwriting on the topmost letter, young, looping, unmistakably a boy's hand, still learning its own confidence, pulled at her in a way she could not resist. It was from Edmund, written, by the date, only weeks before his death, to Julian, who had apparently been away at the time on estate business. It was full of small, ordinary things. A horse Edmund was hoping to be allowed to ride, a joke about their mother's new hat, a line that made Margaret's chest tighten before she even understood why. "Come home soon, brother. Dinner isn't the same without someone to make you laugh at it." She sat very still for a long moment after reading it, the orangery's afternoon light falling gold and indifferent across the page, and she understood with sudden and total clarity something she should have realized weeks before. Julian had not simply lost his brother at that table. He had lost the only person in his life who had ever made him laugh, made him lighter, made him something other than the dull air he had described himself as with such flat resignation. And he had spent 6 years since eating in silence, at the very place where that light had gone out, night after night, a penance no one had asked him to serve, and no one had thought to end. She put the letter back, exactly as she had found it. She did not mention it to him, but that evening at dinner, she found herself watching him, with a tenderness she hadn't fully allowed herself, before a fierce and quiet protectiveness that surprised her with its strength. "You're looking at me strangely," he said, halfway through the meal, with the dry, careful humor that had become, in recent weeks, entirely his own. "I'm looking at you, The way one looks at something one is fond of, she said. I wasn't aware there was a strange way to do that. He set down his fork. The candlelight caught something unguarded in his face, something that had been building for weeks and had finally, in that moment, found its way to the surface. Margaret, he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name without the title attached, without any of the careful formal distance he kept from nearly everyone. I did not expect, when this marriage was arranged, that I would come to feel anything for you beyond obligation. I want you to know that I do feel something. I'm not skilled at saying what, precisely. I am told I do not make sentences that mean things easily. You're doing well enough, she said, her voice unsteady in a way she hadn't anticipated. I have not spoken freely to anyone in 6 years, he said. Not truly. Not the way I speak to you now. I did not think that part of me still existed. I assumed it had been buried with him. He paused, and when he continued, his voice had dropped lower, rougher, the words costing him something visible. You did not ask me to change. You simply made room, again and again, without demanding I fill it on any particular schedule. I don't know how to thank a person for that. I'm not certain thanks is even the right shape for what I feel. Margaret reached across the small distance between their chairs and took his hand, the first time she had touched him with any deliberateness since their wedding day, when their hands had been joined by a vicar rather than by choice. You don't have to thank me, she said. I only did what I would have wanted done for me. His fingers closed around hers, warm and steady, and entirely unlike the cold, formal man she had married a season before. Then I am fortunate, he said quietly, that you married a man so slow to notice what was standing in front of him. It was perhaps inevitable that peace so carefully built would eventually be tested, because peace in a house like Ashworth Hall had always been a fragile, contested thing, and Julian's mother, the Dowager Duchess, had never been a woman inclined to let fragile things simply be. She arrived unannounced on a gray morning in early autumn, her carriage sweeping up the drive with the kind of unhurried authority that suggested she had never once in her life doubted her welcome anywhere. Margaret watched from an upstairs window as the woman descended, dressed in unrelenting black, despite the years since her husband's death, her face arranged in an expression of polite, practiced disapproval that seemed to require no effort at all. She visits perhaps twice a year, Julian told Margaret quietly, as they went down together to receive her. Always without warning, she considers warning a courtesy owed only to equals. The Dowager's greeting to Margaret was a masterpiece of controlled condescension, a brief assessing glance that took in her modest gown, her lack of jewels, the whole unremarkable fact of her, before turning back to her son with the faintest weary sigh of a woman resigned to disappointment. You look well, Julian, she said, in the tone of someone remarking on unexpected weather. Marriage appears to agree with you. I confess I did not anticipate that. Mother, he said, with a courtesy so precise it bordered on a warning. Dinner that evening was a different animal entirely from the quiet, companionable meals Margaret had grown used to. The Dowager commanded the table the way she seemed to command every room she entered, her comments dropping like small, elegant stones into still water, each one calculated to disturb. I understand you draw, she said to Margaret partway through the soup course, in a tone that made the hobby sound faintly indecent. Flowers, is it? How charming. My own daughters were trained in music. A drawing-room accomplishment ought to be audible, in my opinion, so that a hostess's guests may enjoy it from the next room while conversing. I find flowers don't mind an audience or the lack of one, Margaret said evenly. They bloom regardless. Something flickered in the Dowager's eyes, surprise, perhaps, that the quiet young woman her son had married had a tongue at all. How philosophical, she said, in a voice that suggested she found it nothing of the sort. Julian, Margaret noticed, said very little throughout the meal, but his hand found hers once beneath the table, brief and steadying, and she understood it as an apology he could not yet say aloud, and as solidarity he didn't need to. After dinner, the Dowager requested a private word with her son, and Margaret retreated to the drawing room to wait, her sketchbook open on her lap, though she found she could not focus enough to draw. When Julian finally returned, nearly an hour later, his face carried an expression she had not seen on it before. Not the old familiar grief, but something sharper anger, tightly leashed. She wants me to reconsider the marriage, he said, without preamble, sitting heavily beside her. She has found, in the 6 months since our wedding, what she considers a more advantageous match. The daughter of an earl with considerable land adjoining ours. She suggests an annulment might still be arranged, given how quiet the wedding was, how little society has made of it. Margaret's chest went cold. And what did you tell her? I told her, Julian said, that I did not marry for advantage, and that I have no intention of unmarrying for it either. I told her that I have, for the first time in 6 years, found a reason to sit at my own dinner table without wanting to leave it, and that I would not surrender that reason to satisfy a woman's notion of a well-matched acreage. Margaret felt something in her chest loosen that she hadn't realized was tight. She won't accept that easily. No, Julian agreed, she won't. My mother has never in her life accepted a thing simply because she was told it was final. He looked at her, then, steady, certain in a way that still, even now, sometimes surprised her to see in him. But it is final, Margaret. Whatever she does, whatever she says. I want you to know that. I am not a man who changes his mind twice about the things that matter most. The dowager did not leave the following morning as expected. She lingered instead, 3 days, stretching into a week, each meal an exercise in quiet warfare, conducted entirely through the medium of politeness. She asked Margaret pointed questions about her family's modest fortune. She commented more than once on how fortunate it was that Julian had a son's duty to eventually produce an heir, regardless of personal inclination, as though reminding Margaret of the transactional bones beneath even the tenderest marriage. Margaret bore it with the same quiet patience she had once offered Julian's silence, not because she was weak, she was coming to understand, but because she had learned, over months in that house, that patience was not the same thing as surrender. She answered every barbed question honestly and without apology. She did not shrink from the dowager's assessing gaze, and slowly she noticed this seemed to unsettle the older woman more than any argument could have. It was on the 7th evening, over a dinner. Margaret had specifically requested include pheasant, a small, private test she had not explained even to Julian, that everything came to its point. The dowager, seeing the dish, made a small sound of distaste. I'm surprised this is still served here, she said, to no one in particular. Given the history, the table went silent in a different way than Margaret had grown used to. Not comfortable, but held, tense, everyone waiting to see which direction the moment would fall. It served because I asked for it, Margaret said quietly. The dowager's eyebrows rose. Did you? How curious. I would have thought a new bride might avoid reminding my son of his brother's death at every meal. Your Grace, Margaret said, setting down her fork with deliberate care, your son has spent 6 years avoiding a great many things in this house, out of grief and out of a kindness toward everyone around him that meant he never once asked anyone else to sit with him in it. I don't intend to make him avoid anything any longer. Grief handled honestly doesn't wound. It's the grief we're forced to hide that festers. She met the older woman's eyes without flinching. I would think a mother might understand that better than most. The silence that followed was total. Julian beside her had gone very still, but when Margaret glanced at him, she saw something in his expression that looked almost like pride. The dowager's face had tightened into something brittle. You are very free with your opinions, for a woman married 6 months into a family whose grief predates her by years. Perhaps, Margaret said, but I am the one he speaks to now, not out of duty, out of choice. That is not something you can annul, Your Grace, whatever advantageous match you found elsewhere. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, unexpectedly, something shifted in the dowager's expression, not warmth, precisely, but a kind of grudging recalculation, the look of a woman revising an assessment she had been certain of only moments before. You have more spine than I credited you with, she said finally, and there was buried somewhere beneath the frost of her tone something almost like respect. Everyone underestimates quiet people, Margaret said. It's usually a mistake. The dowager left 2 days later. She did not apologize and she did not withdraw her disapproval entirely. Margaret suspected that was simply not in the woman's nature, but she left without raising the subject of annulment again, and in the carriage, just before it pulled away, she paused long enough to say one final thing to her son. "She'll do," the dowager said, in a tone that from her, Julian later explained with dry amusement, constituted the highest praise she was capable of offering anyone. The seasons turned, as they do, indifferent to the small dramas of any single household, and Ashworth Hall settled into a rhythm that Margaret would later think of as the true beginning of her marriage, more than the wedding itself had ever been. Julian spoke more with each passing month, not because his grief had vanished, it never fully did. She came to understand, grief, like his, simply learned to sit quietly in a room without demanding all the light. But because he had last someone willing to let him carry it without judgment, and had discovered, in the carrying, that it weighed less than he'd remembered. They talked, some evenings, about Edmund, freely now, the boy's memory finally allowed back into the house as something to be treasured, rather than avoided. Julian told her about the time Edmund had tried to teach himself to fish and fallen into the lake for his trouble. He told her about Edmund's terrible singing voice and his surprisingly excellent memory for poetry, and the particular specific sound of his laugh, which Julian said he still heard sometimes, in dreams, and which no longer frightened him to remember. Margaret continued to draw, and in time, Julian commissioned, without telling her, a proper glass conservatory built onto the side of the orangery, flooded with light from every angle, filled with the specific flowers she had always loved best and never had the means to grow. When she found it on a morning he'd contrived to have her wander out there alone, she stood in the doorway for a long moment, simply unable to speak. "You didn't have to do this," she said, finally echoing, without meaning to, the words he had once said to her over a small, unremarkable dish set beside a plate of pheasant. "I know," he said, coming to stand beside her, his hand finding hers with the ease of long practice, now, rather than uncertain reaching. "I wanted to. And—" She turned to look at him, this man who had once seemed carved from stone and silence, who now stood beside her with an ease and warmth she still, some mornings, found faintly miraculous. And she felt something settle in her chest that she recognized with quiet astonishment as complete and uncomplicated happiness. "I love you," she said. It was the first time either of them had said it plainly, without the careful indirection they had both grown so fluent in, and the words hung in the bright morning air of the conservatory like something almost visible. Julian did not answer immediately, and for one unsteady heartbeat, Margaret wondered if she had moved too quickly, said too much, asked for a kind of fluency he still hadn't found his way to. But then he lifted her hand and pressed it, very gently, to his chest, over his heart, and she felt it beating there, steady and certain beneath her palm. "I did not know," he said slowly, "that I would ever say this again to anyone. I thought that part of me had gone quiet permanently, the way the rest of me did. But I love you, Margaret. I have for longer than I think I let myself admit, even to you, even to myself." He paused, and something almost like his old dry humor returned to his voice, softened now by the sincerity beneath it. "I am told I do not say such things easily." "You're doing well enough," she said again, her voice thick, echoing her own words from months before, and this time, when he laughed, a real laugh, low and surprised at itself. The kind of sound that had not lived in that house in 6 long years. It filled the whole bright glass room like sunlight finding its way, finally, into every corner. It was not, in the end, a story that ended with grand vindication or public spectacle, the kind of story where a villain is unmasked and a fortune restored before a gasping crowd. It was quieter than that and truer for it. There had been no scheme to uncover, no hidden inheritance, no cruel guardian to defeat in open court. There had only been 2 people, each carrying a private weight, who had found through patience, offered without demand, and honesty offered without flinching, that the weight was easier borne together than alone. Margaret often thought, in the years that followed, about that first cold dinner. The silence so total she could hear her own swallowing, and how frightened she had been of a man she mistook for unfeeling. She thought about how close she had come, in those early weeks, to accepting that coldness as simply the shape of her marriage, the way so many women before her had accepted far worse without ever thinking to look closer. She was glad, every day of her life afterward, that she had chosen instead to watch and to wait and to make room, again and again, for a man to find his way back to his own voice. Julian, for his part, never stopped marveling, quietly, in his own understated way, at the fact that patience such as hers had ever been offered to him at all, unearned, unasked for, extended simply because she was the sort of woman who noticed suffering and could not walk past it without trying to ease it. Their daughter was born the following spring, in the room with the best light in the whole of Ashworth Hall, and Julian held her for the first time with the particular, careful wonder of a man who had once believed himself incapable of holding anything so fragile without breaking it. They named her Edith, close enough to Edmund's name to honor him, gentle enough not to burden the child with too heavy a memory. At dinner that first night, home from the birthing room, exhausted and radiant, Margaret watched her husband across the table. No longer across from her, she remembered, with a small private smile, but beside her, where he had chosen to sit every night since that quiet turning point so long ago. And she thought of how far they had traveled from that first frozen meal, how much distance could be crossed not through grand gestures, but through the slow, patient accumulation of small kindnesses offered and received, night after night, until silence itself had transformed into something worth savoring rather than something to be endured. "You're looking at me strangely again," Julian said, the corner of his mouth lifting in the dry, familiar way she loved best. "I'm looking at you the way one looks at something one is fond of," she said, exactly as she had once before. "I recall that lying," he said. "I believe I told you there was no strange way to do that." "You did," she agreed. "You ate. You were right, as it happens." There isn't. Outside, the evening settled gently over the grounds of Ashworth Hall, gold light falling through the windows of the conservatory, where flowers Margaret had chosen herself bloomed in defiant, unhurried color, and somewhere upstairs their daughter slept in a nursery filled, for the first time in that house in longer than anyone could remember, with nothing but peace. Thank you so much for staying with this story all the way to the end. If it moved you even a little, I would love to know. Tell me in the comments which city you're watching from tonight, and let me know what this story made you feel, or which line stayed with you longest. Stories like Margaret and Julian's are exactly what this channel is built around, so if you enjoyed this one, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories just like it. Until then, from all of us here, good night and sweet dreams.